Mr. Pruitt, tear it down. You have 14 days.
Darla Fitch, HOA president, moved here 3 years ago, was telling me to demolish a smokehouse that had been on this land since 1984. My farm, 1981. Her HOA, 2016. Her audacity, unlimited.
That structure is an eyesore. This neighborhood has standards now.
Darla, this farm was here before your neighborhood had a name, before your streets had pavement, before your HOA had a single rule.
I don't care. 14 days, Crane, or the fines start.
She hung up. What she didn't know, buried inside her own HOA's founding documents, was one clause, written by the developer himself, that made every single thing she'd done for 18 months completely illegal. The smokehouse is still standing. Darla is no longer HOA president. What would you do? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from? Let me take you back to 1981. My grandfather, Eldon Pruitt, bought 22 acres of red clay farmland in Caldwell County, North Carolina, when a handshake still meant something, and the only HOA anyone knew about was the old farmers cooperative that traded seed corn and tractor parts. He built a 2-bedroom farmhouse himself, every nail by hand, and over the following decade added a hay barn, a root cellar, and a squat, solid smokehouse out of cinder block and old-growth pine. That smokehouse smelled like hickory and sassafras and rendered pork fat. It smelled like winter food and hard work and family. The crunch of gravel under a pickup truck, the low moan of the wind off the Blue Ridge, the particular cold morning silence that settles over a farm before the roosters catch up. That was the soundtrack of my childhood. I spent summers with Granddad Eldon, learning how to cure a shoulder, how to read weather in the tree line, how to patch a cinder block wall with a coffee can of mortar and a mason's trowel. The walls of that smokehouse were thick enough to muffle a thunderstorm. I used to press my palm flat against the blocks on November mornings and feel the warmth radiating out from the fire inside, the whole structure breathing like something alive. Eldon passed in 2009. He left the acreage to my father, Merritt Pruitt, who kept farming a few acres of vegetables and running a small beef herd. The smokehouse kept working. Every November, neighbors and cousins showed up for what we called the November pull, a 2-day smoke of hams, ribs, and whatever venison the deer season had given up. The air for half a mile smelled like sweet applewood smoke and brown sugar rub. Nobody complained. There was nobody to complain. Then came the subdivision. In 2016, the farmland east of our property was sold and parceled into a 74-home development called Stonebridge Meadows. Nice houses, 2-car garages, mailboxes shaped like little red barns, which is either charming or insulting when you're standing next to an actual barn. The developer installed an HOA as a condition of the county permit, standard stuff, largely harmless at first. For 3 years, things were fine. The new neighbors would slow their cars on the road to watch the cattle, wave, ask about the smokehouse in a friendly way. Some of them came to the November pull. We sold eggs off a little stand by the fence. It was genuinely nice. Then Darla Fitch got elected HOA president. Darla had moved down from Columbus, Ohio, with her husband, something in finance, and had immediately decided that Caldwell County needed improving. She was meticulous about her own lawn to a degree that qualified as a medical condition, and she had opinions, many of them, about paint colors, about mailbox heights, about the sound of a rooster at 5 a.m. She wore pressed khaki slacks every day of her life and carried a legal pad and a monogrammed leather cover everywhere she went. She was the kind of person who reads the HOA bylaws the way other people read the Bible, selectively and always in her own favor. The first unfair act came in March 2019, packaged as a courtesy. Darla hand-delivered a letter, not an official HOA notice, just a personal note on cream stationery, informing my father that the smokehouse was within visual sightlines of the Stonebridge Meadows development, and that the HOA was exploring community beautification options. She said the structure looked, and I am quoting directly here, agricultural and out of place. Dad read it twice, set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee, and said, "Well, it is agricultural. That's what it is." He wrote back a polite 2-sentence reply. The smokehouse predated the development by 35 years and was operating legally. He wished her well. That, as it turns out, was the wrong answer. Not legally, Legally, it was exactly right. But politically, in Darla Fitch's world, polite indifference was interpreted as an invitation to escalate. Nobody warned us that the first letter was just the opening bell. The official violation started in June 2019, 6 weeks after Dad's polite reply, which told us everything we needed to know about how Darla processed courtesy. The first HOA notice arrived on a Thursday morning, official letterhead this time, citing Section 7.4 of the Stonebridge Meadows CC and RS, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which prohibited unapproved outbuildings visible from common areas or adjacent lots. The Smokehouse, the letter stated, was an unapproved outbuilding and had 14 days to be either removed or screened from view by an 8-foot privacy fence. A fence that would cost, by the contractor quotes Darla helpfully enclosed, somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. There was one enormous foundational problem with this notice. Our property was not part of Stonebridge Meadows. Dad never signed the CC and RS. Our land existed before the development. The HOA had exactly zero legal jurisdiction over our farm. We said as much in our written response, sent certified mail, return receipt requested, a habit that would pay off enormously later. We included the deed, the parcel map, and a single-page explanation. Not your property, not your rules. We even underlined the sentence so Darla would not miss it. She responded 10 days later with a new notice, this time citing a county noise ordinance and claiming the Smokehouse's commercial smoke emissions created a public nuisance. She had apparently called the county environmental office and asked them to investigate. Now here is where Dad made his first genuinely strategic move, and where the story starts to turn. Instead of simply writing back again, he called the county environmental office himself, before they ever came out, and got ahead of the complaint. He invited the inspector for coffee. The inspector, a soft-spoken man named Vernon, who had grown up 2 counties over and had been to more than one November pull in his career, came out on a Tuesday, walked the property, checked the smoker stack, consulted the relevant North Carolina air quality regulations, and determined that a residential wood-fired smoker operating fewer than 30 days per year produced emissions well below any reportable threshold. Vernon's written report said, "No violation found. Operation consistent with agricultural and residential use." He stamped it and handed Dad 2 copies. Dad had Vernon sign one on the hood of the truck, right there in the driveway, in front of a witness, Dad's neighbor Clyde, who had been watching from his fence post with a cup of coffee and the deep satisfaction of a man who is not involved but is thoroughly entertained. Dad mailed a copy of Vernon's report to the HOA, certified mail, return receipt requested. Again. A lesser antagonist would have backed down. Darla Fitch was not a lesser antagonist. Within 2 weeks, she showed up at a county commissioners' meeting, held in a room about the size of a generous dining room, attended by roughly the same number of people, and raised the issue as a community quality of life concern. She brought a petition, 41 signatures, all from Stonebridge Meadows residents. She presented photographs of the Smokehouse taken from maximum zoom from her backyard, making it look roughly the size of a warehouse. She had a PowerPoint, 4 slides. One of them had a red arrow pointing at the Smokehouse stack like it was evidence at a crime scene. The commissioner on duty that evening, a cattle farmer himself named Walt Braddock, who had zero patience for theater, listened to Darla for 4 minutes before interrupting to ask whether the property in question was inside the Stonebridge Meadows HOA boundary. Darla said she believed the farm was adjacent and therefore subject to community standards. Walt asked her to define community standards in a legal context. Darla consulted her legal pad. The room waited. A man in the back row shifted in his plastic chair. The fluorescent light above the door hummed. Walt said, "Ma'am, adjacent means next to, not subject to. Your HOA rules apply to your lots. That farm has been in operation for 40 years. We're adjourned on that item." Darla left the meeting with 41 signatures and nothing else. But she did not leave defeated. She left planning. You could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she folded the petition back into that monogrammed leather cover with the precise, controlled movements of someone who is already drafting the next move. Dad noticed. He said, driving home on the dark county road with the windows down and the smell of honeysuckle coming in off the ditch bank, "She's not done, son. People like that don't quit. They just changed tactics. He was right. But he had also just handed us our first real weapon, the public record. Every certified mail receipt, every environmental clearance, every commissioner's meeting transcript, it was all going into a file, and that file was about to become very important. By fall 2019, Darla had pivoted to property law. She had hired a paralegal, not a lawyer, a paralegal, which is a distinction that matters, to search the county deed records for any easement, covenant, or restriction that might apply to the Pruitt land. It took them 2 months. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. So Darla invented something. In November 2019, the HOA sent a letter, this one addressed not to Dad, but to the county planning office, claiming that the Pruitt property's Smokehouse violated a grandfathered non-conforming use provision because the structure had allegedly been modified after 1995. The argument was that if any part of the Smokehouse had been repaired or altered after a certain date, its grandfathered status might be voided under a specific county zoning update from that year. This was creative. This was also wrong, but it was the kind of wrong that requires a paper trail to disprove. Here is where I entered the story directly, because at this point Dad called me. I work in construction management, so I have a professional relationship with permits, inspections, and building records, and asked me to come home for a weekend and dig through the files. I drove down on a Friday night in early December. The farmhouse was warm, the wood stove was going, and the smokehouse sat in the side yard under a hard white frost, solid and indifferent to everything being said about it in county offices. I could smell the ghost of 40 years of hickory smoke in the cinder blocks when I ran my hand along the wall. That smokehouse was not going anywhere. We spent Saturday in the basement going through Granddad Eldon's files. The man kept everything, bless him, including the original 1984 building permit for the smokehouse, the 1994 re-inspection certificate when he'd relined the stack, and a 1998 photo from a county assessor's visit showing the structure unchanged. Together, those documents formed an unbroken chain of evidence. The smokehouse had not been structurally modified. The grandfathered use was intact. But here is the legal concept that became our second major weapon, and the one I want everyone to write down. Right to farm laws. North Carolina's Right to Farm Act, General Statute 106-700, provides that an agricultural operation that has been in existence for 1 year or more cannot be declared a nuisance due to changed conditions in the surrounding area, as long as the operation was not a nuisance when it began. In plain English, if your farm existed before the neighborhood moved in, the neighborhood cannot use nuisance law to shut you down. The smokehouse was not just protected by deed history and permit records, it was protected by statute. Takeaway. Look up your state's Right to Farm Act. Every agricultural state has one, and many suburban homeowners don't know it covers backyard operations like smokers, chicken coops, and gardens if the property has agricultural zoning history. I drafted a letter, with help from a real estate attorney Dad knew from church, a sharp woman named Constance Waverly who did not charge us for the first consultation, citing GS 106-700 directly, attaching the original building permit, the 1994 inspection, and the 1998 assessor photo. We sent it to the county planning office, to the HOA board, all 5 members, certified mail, and to Darla personally. Constance added one sentence at the bottom of the letter that was worth more than the rest of it combined. Any further attempts to initiate regulatory action against this property without legal basis may be construed as tortious interference and will be responded to accordingly. Tortious interference, the legal term for wrongfully disrupting someone's lawful business or property use, carries civil liability. It was a quiet sentence, professionally polite, and it hit the HOA board like a dropped anvil. 3 of the 5 board members called Dad within a week to distance themselves from Darla's campaign. One of them, a retired postal worker named Jean, apologized directly. Another, a woman named Patsy, who ran a small landscaping business, told Dad privately that the board had never voted to pursue the planning office complaint. Darla had done it entirely on her own authority, using the HOA letterhead like it was her personal stationery. That was the crack. The board was fracturing. Darla had overreached, and her own allies were beginning to notice. Dad listened to each of them politely, said nothing committal, and thanked them for calling. He just kept building the file. Because here's what Dad understood, and what I was starting to understand too. Darla wasn't finished. She was embarrassed, which for a certain kind of person is more motivating than being wrong. And an embarrassed person with a legal pad and a monogrammed leather cover and a grudge is a dangerous thing. The new year brought new tactics. In January 2020, Darla filed a formal complaint with the county health department. This time, claiming the Smokehouse's rendered fat and ash disposal practices were creating a groundwater contamination risk. She submitted a hand-drawn map of the property, hand-drawn, in pen, on graph paper, with a red X marking where she believed our drainage ran toward the development's stormwater system. I still have a photocopy of that map. The handwriting is very neat. The science is completely wrong. The health department takes groundwater complaints seriously and is required by law to investigate them. An inspector came out in February. Dad walked him around the property with a cup of coffee and the patient energy of a man who has been through this before. The Smokehouse drainage ran toward a dry creek bed on the western edge of the farm, 200 yards from the nearest Stonebridge Meadows lot line. The rendered fat was collected in a sealed metal container and taken to a rendering service every year after the November pull, a practice Granddad Eldon had established decades ago because he was a farmer who respected his land and didn't need a regulation to tell him how to behave on it. The inspector found exactly nothing wrong. The health department's dismissal letter was 2 sentences. Dad framed it. I am not joking. He bought a cheap frame at the dollar store, matted it in orange, the same color as the original violation notice, and put the dismissal letter on the wall of the Smokehouse, next to the original 1984 building permit. Wall of Honor, he called it. By spring, there were 4 framed dismissals on that wall. It was becoming a gallery. By now, Constance Waverly had reviewed our full file and given us a more strategic assessment. Darla's complaints, health, planning, environment, noise, commissioner, had one thing in common. They were all using public regulatory agencies as a proxy to harass a private citizen. Each individual complaint was dismissible, but the pattern was what mattered legally. Constance used a specific term, regulatory harassment. She explained that if Darla filed one more baseless complaint with any government agency, we had the factual foundation to pursue a civil harassment claim under North Carolina statute. We could potentially recover attorney's fees, damages, and court costs. We didn't tell Darla that. We let her keep applying pressure. Every new complaint was another brick in our wall. Then Darla discovered social media. In March 2020, a Facebook group for Stonebridge Meadows, roughly 200 members, mostly neighbors sharing lost pet posts and road condition updates, became the venue for Darla's next campaign. She posted a photo of the Smokehouse stack during the one annual event where it produced visible smoke, with the caption, "This is what our neighborhood deals with from the neighboring property. Health hazard? You decide." The photo had been taken during the November pull 4 months earlier. She had held it in reserve, waiting for the right moment. The post got traction fast. A dozen neighbors commented with concern. A few called it a fire risk. One person claimed, without any evidence whatsoever, that the smoke had triggered her child's asthma. The post was shared outside the group. Someone tagged the county's Facebook page. It was the kind of low-grade online mob formation that feels unstoppable until someone steps into the middle of it with the actual facts. This is where Dad did something that, in retrospect, was the single most important act of the entire 18-month campaign. Instead of ignoring the post or responding emotionally or getting into a comment section brawl, he did something Darla absolutely did not expect. He joined the group and posted a response. Not a defensive response, not an angry response. He posted a 3-paragraph history of the Pruitt farm, including the year Granddad Eldon built the Smokehouse, a photograph of Granddad Eldon himself standing in front of it in his work clothes. Work boots, flannel shirt, the same quiet expression Dad has, and an open invitation to the November pull. He wrote, "You're welcome at our farm any time. The Smokehouse has been here since 1984. It will be here long after all of us are gone. We'd love to share what it does." 47 people liked the post within 24 hours. 4 families sent direct messages asking about buying eggs. 2 people commented that they'd had no idea the farm had been there before the subdivision. One woman posted that her grandmother had grown up on a property that used the same type of smoker, and she was in tears reading this. Darla deleted her original post. She could not delete the response. The social media episode revealed something Darla had fundamentally misunderstood. Most of the Stonebridge Meadows residents were not anti-farm. They didn't hate the Smokehouse. They had simply been fed a narrative, and when they encountered a different narrative, a true one, with a human face and a 40-year-old photograph, many of them shifted almost immediately. The community was not Darla's weapon. Darla had been pretending it was, and the pretense had just collapsed in public. But the real story was still underground, and we were about to dig it up. Constance Waverly made a phone call in April 2020 that changed everything. She had been doing what good real estate attorneys do when they smell a pattern. She had gone back to the county deed records and read everything. Not just the Pruitt parcel history, but the history of the entire Stonebridge Meadows development. The original land sale, the subdivision plat, the developer's filings, all of it. And she found something that nobody in the HOA seemed to know about, or, if they knew, had never mentioned. The development had been built on land that included a drainage easement running along the eastern boundary of our farm. That easement, recorded in 1978, predating even Granddad Eldon's purchase, gave the Pruitt property an affirmative right of drainage access across the development's eastern green space. In plain terms, we had a legal right, written into the county records decades before Stonebridge Meadows existed, to use and maintain a drainage corridor running directly through what the HOA considered its private amenity space. That alone would have been useful, but that wasn't the big part. The big part was what Constance found in the development's own HOA filings. When the developer set up the HOA in 2016, he had filed a document called the Declaration of Covenants and Restrictions with the County Register of Deeds. Standard stuff. But buried in Section 14, right between the rules about holiday decorations and the rules about satellite dish placement, was a clause that read, "Nothing in this declaration shall be construed to limit or impair any lawful agricultural operation, including but not limited to livestock, poultry, crop production, or associated processing structures, on any property adjacent to or within 1 mile of Stonebridge Meadows, where such operation predates the recording of this declaration." The developer had inserted that clause specifically because he knew he was building next to working farmland and wanted to protect the HOA from future liability. He had been trying to cover himself legally. In doing so, he had written a permanent legal shield for the Pruitt farm directly into the HOA's own founding documents, and then apparently forgotten to tell anyone it was there. Section 14 made every single complaint Darla had filed, every notice she had sent, every planning office letter she had written, not just legally wrong, but explicitly prohibited by the HOA's own governing document. She had been violating her own rulebook for 18 months. Constance called me before she called Dad because she wanted to think through the strategy carefully. She said, "This is what I'd call a golden ticket, but how you use it determines what you win." We could deploy it immediately, send Darla a letter citing Section 14 and shut the whole thing down in a week. Fast, clean, decisive. Or we could be patient. Let Darla make one more large move. Use Section 14 in a public forum, somewhere with witnesses, cameras, and an official record, where the revelation would be impossible to walk back, minimize, or quietly bury in a certified mail envelope. We chose patience. That evening I sat at the kitchen table with Dad and spread the file out between us. He read Section 14 3 times, set the paper down, and was quiet for a long moment. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the smokehouse sat in the side yard in the dark, 40 years of mortar and cinder block, absolutely unmoved by everything that had been thrown at it. Dad finally said, "Eldon would have laughed himself sick." He looked out the window. "All right, we wait for her to go big, then we end it." We did not have to wait long. The planning phase felt like assembling a machine one part at a time, each piece clicking into place over the course of a quiet summer. The legal foundation was Constance's domain. She assembled what she called the brick wall, a binder organized into 7 tabbed sections. Tab 1, the original 1981 deed and survey, showing the farm boundary predating the development by 35 years. Tab 2, the complete building permit history for the smokehouse, the 1984 original permit, the 1994 maintenance inspection, the 1998 assessor photograph, showing the structure unchanged. Tab 3, the North Carolina Right to Farm Act, GS 106-700, with the relevant passage highlighted in yellow. Tab 4, every regulatory dismissal on record, environmental, health, noise, planning, each with official signatures and government stamps. Tab 5. Every certified mail receipt, organized by date and recipient, showing the full 18-month timeline. Tab 6. Section 14 of the Stonebridge Meadows Declaration of Covenants and Restrictions, with a red margin note that said simply, "She violated this, every time." Tab 7. A one-page legal summary titled, "Summary of HOA Violations of its Own Governing Documents," authored by Constance. 3 paragraphs, no legal jargon, readable by any county commissioner or local newspaper reporter in under a minute. That last tab was the most important. Constance had written it so that a non-lawyer could understand it immediately and explain it to someone else in 30 seconds. She said, "The moment this goes public, you want the story to tell itself. You want the person in the back row of that meeting room to be able to turn to the person next to them and say exactly what happened. That's how you win in public." I have thought about that advice many times since. On the community side, Dad had been quietly tending relationships that Darla had assumed were hers. Jean, the retired postal worker on the HOA board, had become a genuine ally. So had Patsy, the landscaping business owner. Both of them had access to the HOA meeting schedule, the board email list, and, crucially, the agenda-setting process for the annual community meeting, which in Stonebridge Meadows was the one HOA event where all 74 households could attend, speak, and vote on board matters. That meeting was scheduled for the second Saturday of October. It had been on the calendar for months. Darla, focused entirely on her next offensive move, had apparently not given the October meeting much thought. That was her last major strategic error. The physical component of the plan was something I designed myself, and it is the part of this story I am most personally proud of. We knew Darla was going to show up at our property line eventually with something. A surveyor, an inspector, a reporter, something, because that was her pattern. She liked witnesses. She liked an audience. She performed best with people watching. So we built her a stage. I constructed what I called the evidence wall, a weatherproof display board mounted on a treated lumber post just inside our fence line, facing the road and the development. The frame was built from 2x4s, the face from clear polycarbonate sheeting like a large roadside bulletin board. Inside, I mounted laminated copies of every key document: the 1984 building permit, the right to farm statutory citation, the environmental clearance, the health department dismissal, and, centered at eye level in the largest font, Section 14 of the HOA's own declaration. Underneath everything, in clean black capital letters on white stock, "This farm has been here since 1981. This smokehouse has been here since 1984. We are here to stay." I finished it on a Saturday afternoon in late August, standing back on the gravel drive to look at it while the smell of dry grass and red clay came up off the field. Clyde came over from next door, studied it for a long moment without saying anything, and then said, "That is the most satisfying thing I have ever seen on a fence post." He went home and came back with 2 cold sodas. We stood there and looked at it a while longer. The digital component was Dad's daughter-in-law Rosalie's work. She ran a small social media account for the farm's egg stand. Maybe 800 followers, mostly local people, and a few farming enthusiasts. She began quietly documenting the farm's history over 6 weeks of posts. Old photographs of Granddad Eldon, scenes from past November polls, close-up images of the cinder block walls and the hanging hams, and the morning light coming through the smoke vents. No mention of the HOA dispute anywhere, just the farm. By October, the account had 4,200 followers. People were paying attention without knowing quite what they were paying attention to. And in the legal background, Constance filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina HOA Dispute Resolution Office, a state agency created specifically to handle governance abuse cases, documenting Darla's 18-month pattern and citing the Section 14 violation. That filing created an official state record and started a 60-day response clock that would land right around the October annual meeting. Everything was pointed at October. We just needed Darla to do what Darla always did: swing big and miss in public. Darla did not disappoint. In mid-September 2020, 6 weeks before the annual meeting, she made her largest move yet, having apparently concluded that local regulatory agencies were not working fast enough. She went regional. She contacted the Western Piedmont Council of Governments, a regional planning body that issued advisory opinions on land use, and requested a formal review of the Pruitt property's agricultural zoning classification. The argument she presented was elaborate and, in its way, genuinely impressive in its wrong-headedness. She claimed that because the Pruitt property had not filed as an active farm under a specific USDA Farm Service Agency program, it had effectively abandoned its agricultural status. Therefore, she argued, the property's structures could now be subjected to the residential zoning standards of the surrounding development. She had done research. She had printed out USDA program guides. She had highlighted the relevant passages. She showed up to the council offices in the pressed khakis with the legal pad, and she was very, very confident. There was one foundational problem. Constance had anticipated this exact argument, because it was the kind of argument that comes from someone who has read a lot of program summaries without reading the underlying law. USDA FSA program enrollment is voluntary. It confers benefits, crop insurance, loan access, conservation payments, but non-enrollment does not revoke agricultural status. Agricultural status in North Carolina is determined by the property's deed classification and actual land use, period. The Pruitt land was deeded agricultural. The land had cattle on it. The land had always had cattle on it. End of analysis. Constance wrote a 4-page response to the Council of Governments, citing 7 statutes. The council issued a 2-sentence opinion. The property in question retains agricultural zoning classification under applicable state law. No further review is warranted. Darla received a copy. So did the HOA board, the county planning office, and 3 local news outlets to which Constance had quietly forwarded a courtesy notification of the original filing. A reporter from the Caldwell County Messenger, a weekly paper with a website and a surprisingly engaged Facebook following, called Dad the following Thursday. She had read the full documentation. She wanted to do a feature story. Dad told her he'd be happy to talk after the October annual meeting, and suggested she might want to attend and bring a camera. Meanwhile, Darla's behavior within the HOA was becoming visibly erratic. Jean told us that at the September board meeting, she had proposed levying a special assessment on all Stonebridge Meadows homeowners to fund ongoing legal consultations regarding adjacent property nuisances. The board voted it down 4-1. Darla was the one. She had gone from HOA president to a minority of 1 on her own board, without apparently noticing the transition. She had also, according to Patsy, begun attending board meetings with a new advisor, a man she introduced as a community standards consultant, but who turned out to be a friend from Columbus with no legal credentials and a background in residential property management. He sat in the back of the room at every meeting and took notes on a yellow legal pad, a mirror image of Darla. Nobody knew what case he was building. The board was nervous. 2 members asked Patsy privately whether they had any personal liability if Darla's actions resulted in a lawsuit. The answer, Constance told us when we relayed the question, was, potentially, yes. Board officers who knowingly allow or facilitate a pattern of harassment can share liability exposure under certain conditions. Patsy passed that information back to the 2 nervous board members. The board got more nervous. Then came the incident that essentially handed us the public moment we'd been waiting for. On the last Saturday of September, Darla showed up at the edge of the road with a professional surveyor, hired independently out of her own pocket, and attempted to have him survey the boundary between the development's eastern green space and the Pruitt property. She wanted to establish that our drainage easement ran in a different location than our deed showed, which would have complicated our drainage rights and potentially given her new legal footing. What she did not know was that Dad had spotted her car on the road 20 minutes earlier and called Constance, who called the surveyor's licensing board to confirm that the survey request, being made by a person without legal standing to commission a boundary survey on a disputed property, was procedurally improper. The surveyor was informed of this by phone while he was still setting up his equipment on the roadside. He listened, asked 2 questions, packed up his tripod, and drove away without a word to Darla. She stood at the road's edge for a full 5 minutes after his truck disappeared, legal pad pressed to her chest, staring at the evidence wall mounted on our fence post. She read section 14 from 15 feet away. You could see her reading it, the large black letters, the laminate catching the afternoon sun. Dad watched from the porch. He did not go out. He did not wave. He just watched. October was coming. The 2 weeks before the annual meeting were a sustained, desperate campaign of smear. Darla had apparently concluded, correctly, that the regulatory route was exhausted, the legal route was expensive and losing, and the community sentiment had shifted against her after Dad's Facebook post. So she turned to the one weapon she had left: reputation damage. If she couldn't remove the Smokehouse legally, she could try to make the Pruitt name toxic enough that the community would want to force the issue themselves. She began circulating a printed flyer, printed physically, on paper, hand-delivered to mailboxes throughout Stonebridge Meadows on a Tuesday night, that made a series of pointed insinuations about the Pruitt farm. The flyer described the property as a commercial slaughterhouse operation. We processed our own beef and game. No commercial slaughter of any kind had ever occurred on the property. It called the Smokehouse a fire risk to the surrounding neighborhood. The structure was inspected, had a cleared buffer zone, and had operated without incident for 36 years. Most damagingly, it described the farm as a source of unregulated chemical runoff affecting Stonebridge Meadows' water quality. The exact claim the county health department had investigated and dismissed in writing 8 months earlier. The flyer was not signed by Darla. It was attributed to concerned Stonebridge residents, a name appearing nowhere in any official HOA document because it was not an organization. It was Darla, and we were fairly certain, the Columbus consultant with the yellow legal pad. Dad photographed the flyer the morning it appeared and texted it to Constance before his first cup of coffee was finished. Constance moved quickly. She sent a letter to the full HOA board, all 5 members, noting that the distribution of materially false statements designed to damage a property owner's reputation could constitute defamation, and that the HOA, as the governing body of the community from whose membership the flyer appeared to originate, had a strong interest in publicly disavowing its contents before any legal action was initiated. She gave them 48 hours. Jean called an emergency board meeting the following evening. Patsy seconded the motion to disavow. The vote was 4-1. A formal written disavowal was drafted, printed, and hand-delivered to every household in Stonebridge Meadows within 72 hours of the original flyer. The same mailboxes, the same method, a direct repudiation. Darla voted against the disavowal. The board noted her dissent in the official minutes. She was now formally isolated on her own board. Her own community was receiving official letters, walking back her claims, and the annual meeting was 6 days away. Anyone with good strategic judgment would have withdrawn, apologized, and found a quiet way to step back from the HOA presidency before the meeting made it ugly. Darla Fitch was not in a place for good strategic judgment. In the final days before the meeting, she made 2 last moves. First, she attempted to remove the Section 14 agenda item, the one Constance had formally filed. By claiming it had been submitted improperly, Jean produced the signed petition from 4 board members and the relevant bylaw, which was unambiguous. The item stayed on the agenda. Second, she called the county building department and filed one last complaint. She claimed the evidence wall I had built on our fence post was an unpermitted sign structure that violated county signage ordinances. The county building inspector came out the next morning. He measured the structure, checked the relevant ordinance, and noted in his report that the display board was under the square footage threshold requiring a permit, was located entirely within our property boundary, and contained no commercial advertising. He wrote, "No violation," and handed Dad the paperwork before lunch. Dad walked it straight to the Smokehouse and added it to the wall of honor. Frame number 8. That night, Rosalie posted one final photograph on the farm account. No caption, just the Smokehouse at dusk, the last light of the day catching the old pine rafters, visible through the open door. Smoke-darkened wood that had been aging in that building since before most of Stonebridge Meadows was a thought in a developer's mind. The image was reshared 890 times overnight. 3 local television stations followed the account by morning. The CBS affiliate out of Hickory called Rosalie directly and asked if they could send a crew to the annual meeting. She said yes. The night before the meeting, Dad and I sat in the kitchen doing what farmers do before something important. Not very much. He sharpened a pocket knife Eldon had given him in 1987. I went through the binder one last time. The brick wall was complete. Every certified mail receipt, every regulatory dismissal, Every letter sent and received over 18 months of battle. Dad poured 2 fingers of bourbon, passed one across the table, and said, "Your granddad mixed the mortar for that smokehouse cold, early November, so it would cure slow and hard. He said anything worth keeping is worth building right." We went to bed. The Stonebridge Meadows annual meeting was held on the second Saturday of October in the community room of the HOA clubhouse. A clean, carpeted space with folding chairs, a projector screen, and fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency designed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. Capacity, 60 people. Attendance, 72. People lined the walls 3 deep. Someone had dragged in extra chairs from the adjacent room, and they were full too. The CBS affiliate camera was set up in the back left corner. Operator in a blue vest, red light glowing. The Caldwell County Messenger reporter had a notebook, a recorder, and the focused expression of a person who has read all the documents and knows what's coming. Commissioner Priscilla Kearns, who had reviewed the full file Constance sent to the county, sat in the second row along the wall in a dark blazer, identifying herself quietly to Jean before the meeting started. Darla opened precisely on time. She called roll with the efficiency of someone trying to eat clock. She moved through the treasurer's report without pausing for questions. She pushed through the landscaping bid approval and the road maintenance update at a pace that told everyone in the room she was trying to reach adjournment before Item 6 could breathe. Then Jean said, "Item 6, review of HOA President's compliance with Section 14 of the Declaration of Covenants and Restrictions." The room went quiet, in a way that rooms do when everyone present has been waiting for the same moment. Jean was not a dramatic person. He was a retired postal worker in a barn coat, who spoke at the measured pace of a man who spent 30 years making sure the right things got to the right people. He put on his reading glasses, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and read Section 14 aloud. Every word. The room listened to every word. You could hear the fluorescent light hum. Then Constance stood. David had invited her as a non-member guest, permitted under the HOA bylaws. She presented the summary document, tab 7, 1 page, 3 paragraphs, at the deliberate speed of a person who wants each sentence to arrive separately. Paragraph 1, what Section 14 says, in plain language. Paragraph 2, a chronological summary of 18 months of HOA president actions, every complaint, every letter, every regulatory filing, and how each one violated the clause the HOA's own developer had written in 2016. Paragraph 3, 1 sentence of legal conclusion. She set the paper on the table and sat down. Then Dad stood up. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and his good work boots. He held up the binder, not dramatically, just held it up so the room could see its thickness, and spoke without notes. "This is 18 months of my family defending our farm from actions that the HOA's own founding document prohibited from the beginning. 7 certified mail receipts, 4 government agency dismissals, a state filing with the HOA Dispute Resolution Office. My grandfather built that smokehouse in 1984. I am not tearing it down. I am asking this board and this community to acknowledge what was done in their name and what their own rules actually say." He sat down. 4 seconds of silence. Then a woman in the third row started clapping, and it spread through 72 people in about 3 seconds flat. Not a polite board meeting applause, but the real kind, the kind that means people have been waiting to do it. Darla's response was the response of a person who has lost, but has not yet processed it. She said Section 14 was subject to interpretation. She said the HOA had a responsibility to uphold community standards. She said it in the tone of someone reciting lines from a script that no longer fits the scene. The room did not respond the way rooms respond to authority. It responded the way rooms respond to someone reading the wrong speech at the wrong event. Commissioner Kearns spoke from her chair along the wall. She said she had reviewed the documentation and found it comprehensive and credible, and that the North Carolina HOA Dispute Resolution Office had formally notified the county of an open inquiry into the matter. The camera operator in the blue vest made a small adjustment. The messenger reporter wrote something in her notebook. Patsy moved for a vote of no confidence in the HOA president. Jean seconded. The vote was called. 5 board members, 5 votes. The result was unanimous. Darla set her legal pad on the table. She picked up the monogrammed leather cover. She walked to the door of the clubhouse and pushed it open and walked out. The door swung shut behind her, with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The camera caught all of it. Outside, in the parking lot, 2 Stonebridge Meadows residents, who had never spoken to my father before, walked up and shook his hand. One of them said, "We didn't know any of this was happening. We're sorry it went this far." Dad said, "It's all right, you know now." Then we drove home on the dark county road, windows down, and the smell of dry leaves and red clay came in off the fields. And the smokehouse was waiting in the side yard, exactly where it had always been. The resolution came in layers, the way real resolutions do. Not a single dramatic moment, but a series of quiet confirmations that the thing is genuinely over. Within 2 weeks of the annual meeting, the HOA board, now operating with Jean as interim president, sent Dad a formal letter acknowledging that all previous HOA communications regarding the Pruitt property had been issued without legal authority under Section 14, and that the board disavowed them in full. The letter included an apology. Not the lawyered kind, the careful non-admission language that means nothing. An actual sentence that said, "We are sorry for the distress this caused your family." Jean told us later that sentence took the board 40 minutes to agree on, and that he had insisted on it. The North Carolina HOA Dispute Resolution Office issued its formal finding in November. The former HOA president had engaged in a sustained pattern of unauthorized harassment of an adjacent agricultural property owner in direct violation of the HOA's own governing documents. The office recommended that Stonebridge Meadows revise its bylaws to include explicit Section 14 compliance language and mandatory orientation for all future board officers. The board adopted the recommendation unanimously at its November meeting, the first meeting without Darla in 18 months. Constance reviewed our options for civil action against Darla personally. We had a viable case: the regulatory filings, the defamatory flyer, the unauthorized survey attempt. Dad listened to the full analysis, asked a few questions, and then said, "She's gone. The farm is protected. That's the win." Constance said it was the right call. She said sometimes the best use of a strong legal position is to simply hold it, let the other person know you have it, and walk away. Dad walked away. The CBS story aired and was picked up by Regional Wire Services. North Carolina farm family defeats HOA using HOA's own rules. That was the headline. Dad was briefly and improbably internet famous in the way that quiet, competent people sometimes become famous. Everyone shared the story, half the comment section suggested he run for office, and he himself did not read most of it because there was a lot of work to do, and the cattle did not care about the CBS affiliate. The November poll that year was the largest in the farm's history. 43 people came. 11 of them were Stonebridge Meadows residents, including Jean, Patsy, and the woman who had commented on Darla's Facebook post about her grandmother's farm. The smoke came off the hickory in long, gray ribbons all day Saturday and most of Sunday. The air smelled like brown sugar rub and rendered fat and applewood, the same way it had smelled every November since 1984, and if anything, it smelled a little sweeter that year. The evidence wall stayed on the fence post through the winter. In the spring, Dad took it down carefully, preserved all the documents in the binder with the rest of the file, and replaced it with a simple painted sign. Pruitt Farm, established 1981, welcome. The community initiative that came out of all this was something nobody planned but everyone seemed to need. Dad partnered with Patsy's landscaping business, Jean, and 2 other Stonebridge Meadows families to establish the Eldon Pruitt Agricultural Education Fund, a scholarship of $1,500 per year, awarded annually to a Caldwell County High School student pursuing agricultural or land management studies. The fund is now in its 4th year. The first recipient was a 17-year-old from the county vocational program who wanted to study sustainable land management. She came to the farm to meet Dad, and he showed her the smokehouse. She put her hand flat against the cinder block wall the same way I had that December night in 2019, feeling for the mortar, the density, the cold solidity of something built to last. "How old is this?" she asked. Dad said, 40 years. Granddad mixed the mortar cold so it would cure slow and hard. He said anything worth keeping is worth building right. She nodded like that made complete sense, because it does.